Do I really need to say anything here? So, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for DOS. No matter how much you do or don't like the original NES game, the DOS port is an incomplete, broken, buggy mess that you can't even beat unless you cheat. Thus, why are we taking another look at it? Well, because this game does things quite a bit differently than the NES game it's based off of, and for the longest time I've wondered, what exactly is going on under the hood? And more specifically, how is it calculating damage and hit points? Both this port and the original NES game show a health bar with 8 segments, but here in the DOS port, this bar can go down just single columns of pixels at a time, so health is clearly more granular than just 8 full hit points or 16 half hit points. And so yeah, that's what we're going to be primarily focusing on today, is how the hit points work, how many hit points everything has, and how much damage everything does. One of the reasons why this is even possible too is because this port, unlike the NES original, has a save system in place. More specifically, you could have one save file at a time, and while the save file is surprisingly large, this is because it's storing all kinds of extraneous data, which could have just been reloaded. Not to mention it's got a lot of empty space in it. Effectively, the save will put you back into the game at the exact position you saved at, with the exact camera position, on the exact frame of animation you were in, but all enemies for the area are respawned to their default positions, and it also tends to forget which animations it's even playing. So yeah, it's kind of not surprising that this save system is actually kinda glitchy. Well, it's incredibly important when performing a save that you're standing still, as any kind of motions can completely screw up how it handles the reload. For instance, if you save the game on an overworld section while you have your weapon stabbing out in front of you, then reload the save, suddenly your turtle will be swimming in the ground. Now, this is just aesthetic. Your collision box and movements still work as though the correct sprites are in use, and the moment you attack, you're back to normal. And I also need to point out that anytime the boss health gauge appears on screen, saving gets disabled until after the next screen transition occurs, giving you a game not saved message instead. However, the save files themselves are not obfuscated, so I was able to rapidly determine where health and item data was being stored. This led to some interesting revelations. For instance, each turtle's maximum health is exactly 128 units, meaning each of those red squares on the health gauge are representative of 16 hit points, even though they can each only visually show 7 pixels of health, so the representation can be a little wonky if you're trying to measure stuff out exactly. Furthermore, health is stored in a 16-bit integer, even though it would have fit just fine in an 8-bit byte. Thus, you can set your health to rather ridiculous amounts, and amazingly, the game just freaking rolls with it. Now, that said, we're going to be making liberal use of the cheat codes throughout this video, so I made it a point to figure out what exactly is going on with them, as online sources generally get them wrong, or just tell you to rapidly hit random keys on the top row of letters for invincibility, or the middle row for overworld collisions. Well, it turns out the codes are actually much simpler than that, and each come down to holding 3 specific letters on the keyboard simultaneously. For invincibility, you hold down the letters Q, R, and P all simultaneously, and this triggers the invincibility to turn on or off, indicated with the word on or off, briefly flashing at the bottom of the screen. For overworld collisions, which also affects underwater collisions, you hold the letters G, A, and S simultaneously. Yep, you're basically turning the gas on and off for overworld collisions, which will show off to indicate no collisions, and on to indicate turning the collisions back on. You do have to be careful with these codes though. For instance, turning off overworld collisions and trying to touch the bottom of the screen while you have ropes in your inventory results in some very broken behavior. In fact, there's a spot in the third area where you normally collect the ropes, where you can pull off this glitch without disabling collisions, and as a kid, this was how I managed to glitch the game into taking me to the fourth area, since back then, I didn't know these codes existed. But then what about the sub-weapons? Well, there should be 4 sub-weapons in the game. Shurikens, triple shurikens, boomerangs, and kyais. Often called scrolls since kyai in Japanese normally just refers to the kinds of shouts and grunts martial artists make when they perform. Really, I feel like there's some kind of confusion going on between what these things are versus what they were named, and we may never know exactly what the intention here was. Regardless, in the original NES game, you could get shurikens, triple shurikens, and boomerangs as random drops from the enemies, while the kyais could only be acquired from a specific location in Area 3. However, it's long been presumed that this DOS port of the game does not have random drops, and thus the only sub-weapons you could acquire would be the kyais in Area 3, plus there's a spot in Area 5 where you can indeed find boomerangs. However, I have an old memory of acquiring a random shurikens drop from an enemy while playing this game as a kid. So a part of me feels like random drops are indeed in the game, just that the math involved is glitched, and so they're either exceedingly rare or can only occur under incredibly specific circumstances, or maybe they just glitched into existence. That wouldn't surprise me either. But the key takeaway is that I remember the shurikens being in the game, and now that I have the skills to hack save files, we can now know for certain. So, by changing the appropriate bytes and reloading the save file, do the shurikens work? Yes they do. Heck, even the triple shurikens work. So since these weapons are in the game, just incredibly unlikely to ever be acquired legitimately, we're going to test them out too. And if anyone can figure out how they can be obtained without breaking the game or hacking save files, feel free to let me know and I'll add those details into the video description. But for now, it's time to start dishing out and taking damage. My goal here is to go through each area and attempt to measure how much damage the different turtles can do with their primary weapons, how much damage their sub-weapons do, and how much damage the turtles can take from various sources. For dealing damage, I'm simply counting how many strikes of a weapon it takes to take something out, and for receiving damage, I'm doing the same thing, recording how many hits something needs to do from a full health bar to take out a turtle. Now, in some instances, this was a bit tricky, especially considering that weapon shots fired by an enemy often do very different amounts of damage compared to touching said enemy. Plus, if a bunch of different kinds of enemies are clustered together, it makes it hard to gauge them appropriately. Now, hopefully, with enough data collected, the metrics will line up well enough that we can deduce the actual hit point amounts. In fact, one trick we can use to simplify this process has to do with the granularity of the health gauge, since so long as a partially filled box is showing, our margin of error is only a single hit point. 3 hit points if only full and empty squares are showing. Still, this means so long as the damage dealt lands a turtle on at least 2 separate hit point counts with a partial hit point box showing, we can deduce the exact amount of damage that turtle is taking from that attack. Now, if a particular enemy does not offer us this advantage, and so long as we're not in a boss fight, an alternative is to take a hit, save the game, and check the remaining hit points in the hex editor. But with a little luck, we can avoid having to do that. Now, as for dealing damage, we have no such tricks at our disposal, except maybe during boss fights if the hit points the bosses visually lose per attack are consistent across every fight. So we'll definitely keep tabs on that data too. And one last thing to get out of the way before we start collecting and processing that data is that the damage the turtles can do works very differently in this game compared to the NES game. In the NES game, by default, Leonardo and Michelangelo are both equally the weakest, followed by Raphael, with Donatello being the strongest. However, there's a special mechanic whereby when a turtle is at half health or lower, their weapons get a damage boost. Now, I say it this way because it also affects the sub-weapons, but the sub-weapons only get a very tiny boost in damage no matter which turtle you're playing as. Beyond that, Mikey's nunchucks get the biggest damage boost, effectively almost double, followed by Leo's katanas, which get about a 50% boost, followed by Donnie's bow staff, which only gets about a 10% boost, followed by Raph's sais, which actually don't get any boost at all. When below half health, the order of weakest to strongest turtle without sub-weapons becomes Raphael, followed by Leonardo, followed by Michelangelo, with Donatello still being the top turtle. Now here in the DOS port, the damage boost mechanic is completely absent, and instead the turtles are ordered in power from weakest to strongest, right down the line presented in the game menu, with Leo being the weakest, followed by Raph, then Mikey, then Donnie still is the strongest. Anyways, let's kick things off with Area 1. The overworld segments here feature foot soldiers and roller cars, while the interior sections showcase quite the variety of enemies right off the bat, including mousers, flapjaws, and foot soldiers at first, followed by golems, hanks, chainsaw maniacs, and stick-em-ups in the middle sections, and a mix of physicalskis, boogie beetles, and a single laser shooter for the final location. And yeah, I know, that's a lot of names which don't mean anything, and quite frankly, I don't think some of these enemies actually have official names. I'm just going by the general consensus based on names which have appeared for these things in whatever publications and documents have shown any such names over the years. And I will provide graphics for the enemies on screen where appropriate, so you all know what I'm even talking about. A couple other general things I should point out too is that on the overworld, you can't use sub-weapons, but then there's hardly any enemies you can attack, so that's not really going to matter. Plus, my testing showed that shurikens and triple shurikens both do the same amount of damage, plus Leonardo's katanas and the boomerangs also do the same amount of damage. And since Leonardo's katanas and the boomerangs do the least amount of damage of all attacks, any enemies which die to a single strike of those weapons effectively have just one hit point, even though they might actually have more. I figured one of the first ways to see if I could dial in the weapon damage rates was to go up against Bebop, the first of the two bosses in this first area, since he shows a health bar with an initial value of 4 filled squares and a partial square with 3 out of 7 lines filled. If the hit points for Bebop are being reported the same as the hit points for the Turtles, this means Bebop has either 72 hit points or 73 hit points. I then started calculating through the attacks. Leo takes him out in 12 swings, Raph in 9, Mikey in 8, and Donnie in 6. Correlating those attack rates with the way the HP bar was decreasing, the initial impression is that Leonardo does 6 hit points of damage with his katanas, Raphael does 8 hit points damage with his sais, Michelangelo does 10 hit points damage with his nunchucks, and Donatello does 12 hit points damage with his bow. Thus, these are the metrics I'm gonna stick with for now, unless I find evidence to suggest that these numbers might be wrong. I also followed up on this with the shurikens and the Ki scrolls, and found that the shurikens deal 9 hit points damage, while the Ki scrolls deal a whopping 26 hit points of damage each, which is considerable. And I should also point out that even though the enemies all get post-hit invincibility when you strike them, it's a very brief amount, meaning that when a sub-weapon stays in contact for longer than that period of time, it can actually strike a second time. This is particularly noticeable with the boomerangs, plus the triple shurikens, because they have a much larger hitbox behind them than they really ought to have. But hey, I'm not complaining. So, with these attack values in mind, and understanding how the health gauge works for the turtles normally, I started going through all of the Area 1 enemies as best as I could, while going back and retesting things which didn't land on precise metrics to the best of my abilities. But starting with the overworld enemies, the foot soldiers die in a single hit from any attack and deal 10 hit points of damage on contact, able to take out a turtle from full health in 13 hits. The roller cars effectively have 48 hit points, possibly 47, but there was no way to test for that. And unlike in the NES game, where they're an insta-kill, here they only deal 20 hit points of damage, and thus they have to run over a turtle 7 times to actually defeat one. Heading down into the sewers, we first find mousers, which die in 1 hit and deal 7 hit points of damage on contact, as well as flapjaws, which also die in 1 hit but deal 9 hit points of damage instead. Plus, we also find some foot soldiers down here, which aren't afraid to throw their own shurikens at you. Now, I should point out that many enemy projectiles can be destroyed with attacks, but trying to figure out the hit points of those projectiles was more or less a losing battle. So for enemy projectiles, I am only measuring how much damage they do and not how many hit points they have. The foot soldiers themselves effectively have 12 hit points, possibly 11, but there's no way to test for that. They dish out 17 hit points of damage on contact, and their shurikens only deal 9 hit points of damage. Yeah, I should probably also point out quickly that because the damage values I can deal with the turtles and their sub-weapons are 6, 8, 9, 10, 12, and 26, there are some blind spots I can't account for. Specifically, I cannot test for anything less than 6, and above 6, I cannot test for 7, 11, and 13. However, any hit point numbers from 14 and up, I can test for with clever switching between the turtles' weapons and shurikens. Though because I didn't know I could do that when I recorded all of my footage, I'm going back and testing things more conclusively off camera as I scrub through the footage and find the spots where I need to narrow things down better. Now before we move on to the next section of Area 1, we have to face Bebop, who just tries to ram and punch us to death. As previously indicated, he had either 72 hit points or 73 hit points, but I ultimately confirmed it was 72. And his attacks deal 19 hit points of damage, allowing him to defeat a turtle in just 7 hits. Following this fight, we move on to the next section of the area and encounter some new foes. The Stick-em-ups effectively have 8 hit points and deal 11 hit points of damage on contact. The Flying Hanks effectively have 14 hit points and deal 10 hit points of damage. The Chainsaw Maniacs have 32 hit points and are able to shred you for 18 hit points of damage, while the Golems have 28 hit points, deal 17 hit points of damage on contact, plus the projectiles they throw are able to do 14 hit points of damage. But once we get to the final building of the area, we have even more new enemies to face. The Boogie Beetles flying in the air have 9 hit points and also deal 9 hit points of damage on contact. The Physikalskis were incredibly hard to pin down because they constantly move towards you, but with some effort, I figured out they have 16 hit points, deal a whopping 24 hit points of damage on contact, but their boomerangs only deal a measly 6 hit points of damage. There also happens to be a singular laser shooter robot, which has 18 hit points, also deals 24 hit points of damage on contact, and its lasers, despite being easy to dodge because of how slow they move, deal an equally deadly 22 hit points of damage. Finally, at the top of the building, we find Rocksteady holding April O'Neil hostage. Rocksteady himself has 96 hit points, deals 23 hit points of damage on contact, and the shots from his gun only deal 9 hit points of damage. Moving on to Area 2, there are technically no new enemies we haven't already faced, but there are a couple moments where we fight Chainsaw Maniacs as mini-bosses, and in these moments, they get a health bar which starts at 2 full squares, which matches up pretty precisely with the 32 hit points that they should have. However, once we're done with the interior section, we jump off of the dam into the underwater section, and while we can't attack anything, there are things here which can hurt us. The electric barriers deal 6 hit points of damage, the spinning disc thing also deals 6 hit points of damage, the seaweed deals 8 hit points of damage, which also helps to confirm that landing on 0 hit points exactly will still result in your demise, and the glowing orange stuff growing from the depths of this dam is an insta-kill, so stay as far away from it as you can. Also, with the collisions disabled, we can see a message spelled out in the level geometry which reads, "Dean and Mike rule." Gonna hazard a guess that secret message ain't there if you go searching for it out of bounds in the original NES game, if you can. Area 3 introduces a lot of new enemies, plus has the literally impossible jump, which prevents clearing the area without using cheat codes or glitches. Plus, you'll need to collect ropes to get across the rooftops and AFC missiles to get through some of the barricades on the overworld, where AFC stands for Anti-Foot Clan. So let's kick off the roster with some of the more basic enemies that we'll be facing. Blood Eyes, Fleetuses, Winged Bombs, and Balloon Bombers. The Blood Eyes die in 1 hit and deal 9 hit points of damage on contact. The Fleetuses also die in 1 hit and deal 9 hit points of damage on contact. The Winged Bombs took some creative thinking to nail down because they're kind of a one-and-done enemy, but they effectively have 8 hit points and deal 18 hit points of damage on contact, while the Balloon Bombers die in 1 hit, deal 15 hit points of damage on contact, and the bombs they drop deal a huge 26 hit points of damage. But the thing to remember is that the AI for these things always drops their bombs early, meaning if they're floating higher than you are and you just stand still, they'll never hit you. Now let's get to some of the more insidious enemies, such as the Fire Freaks. These guys took some effort to figure out because they are constantly spawning little firebugs and will flood the sprite limits within moments, to the point where other enemies can't even spawn correctly. The Fire Freaks themselves have 23 hit points and deal 15 hit points of damage on contact, while the Firebugs they release die in one hit and can only deal a paltry 5 hit points of damage to the turtles. Next up are the Robos, which don't seem too threatening at first, but once you destroy their bodies, their heads detach and start flying around. Now, the Robo itself has 24 hit points and deals 17 hit points of damage on contact. The fire it shoots out as it walks deals 12 hit points of damage. Then once you destroy the body, leaving just the head behind, the head has 12 hit points and deals 7 hit points of damage on contact. Now, next are the giant frogs, which were pretty easy to figure out, as they have 40 hit points and deal 21 hit points of damage on contact. But then the final regular enemy of Area 3 are the Mr. Bios. At first, these things may not seem too dangerous, as they just walk around at a fair pace and deal 20 hit points of damage on contact. But they quote-unquote die in one hit because hitting them with any weapon splits them into two smaller versions, which are far more deadly, each of which run around wildly, still do 20 hit points of damage on contact, and have a ridiculous 128 hit points to burn through to get rid of them. Seriously, trying to fight these things is more dangerous than some of the bosses. Though speaking of bosses, the final boss of this area is the Mecha Turtle, which is a two-phase fight. In its first phase, the Mecha Turtle is disguised to look like one of our titular ninja heroes, has 80 hit points, and deals 26 hit points of damage on contact either with itself or its katana. But once you break the disguise, it takes on its true robotic form, and begins flying around shooting homing missiles at you. Its true form has 96 hit points, deals 29 hit points of damage on direct contact, and its missiles deal 19 hit points of damage. Area 4 doesn't actually introduce that much that's new in terms of enemies, and is more about dealing with obstacles, though the overworld does have planes flying overhead which drop bombs on you, with those bombs doing 24 hit points of damage. But other than that, the only new enemy really are these laser turrets, which themselves don't actually hurt the turtles and are taken out in a single strike, but the lasers they fire also deal 24 hit points of damage. Now, in terms of obstacles, there's spikes on the floors, walls, and ceilings, which work just like the seaweed from Area 2, and do the same amount of damage per impact, 8 hit points. There are lava pits, which are insta-kills, as well as a set of special spike walls which close in right before the boss, which are also insta-kills. The boss itself is a quote, big mouser, and while it technically can deal damage from directly touching it, trying to pull this off intentionally is almost impossible, so I don't actually know how much damage the main body does, seeing as the moment you get close, it fires a stream of fast-moving laser blasts which do a massive 31 hit points of damage, just like its normal eye lasers, which do the same amount of damage. This is also the first boss presenting a full health bar, and sure enough, it really does have 128 hit points just like the turtles themselves. As so far, all of the damage metrics are lining up as expected. Area 5 is made up almost entirely of new stuff, but a little less than the prior areas since there's only 2 buildings and 3 underground sections. There is a new enemy appearing on the overworld which beams down a searchlight, and if you touch the searchlight or even the enemy itself, it spawns a foot soldier. But you otherwise can't attack these searchlights and they don't directly attack you. Inside the buildings, we find 2 new kinds of enemies, birdies and climb busters. The birdies die in one hit and deal 11 hit points of damage on contact, while the stones they drop are slightly stronger at 13 hit points of damage, while the climb busters have 8 hit points and deal 15 hit points of damage on contact. Now, in the underground sections, though, we find a much more eclectic selection of enemies, the most notorious of which are called Rollin' Gales, as they roll around everywhere and spit acid. They themselves have 47 hit points, deal 22 hit points of damage on contact, and their spit only deals 6 hit points of damage. There's also Dust Stalkers dropping from ceiling strings, which have 9 hit points, deal 15 hit points of damage on contact, and the blobs they drop deal 18 hit points of damage. Then we have the jellyfish, which are kinda odd in that as soon as you get close to them, they explode. But what's weird is that the jellyfish themselves do actually deal a different amount of damage on contact, but the only way to actually ever see this is to intentionally jump straight into one. Regardless, they go down in a single hit if you can manage it from a distance. They do 11 hit points of damage on contact if you can manage it, but more likely you'll get hit by one of their particles when they explode, which do twice as much damage at 22 hit points. The last enemy type of the underground is the Needle Beast. Now, the tricky thing here is that needle beasts do have a projectile attack of firing a cloud of needles, but I have no idea how much damage those bursts of needles do, because they are always fired in the opposite direction of your turtle, and they move at the same speed as your turtles, so it's virtually impossible to get hit by the darn things. Now, as for the needle beasts themselves, they have 44 hit points and deal 21 hit points of damage on contact. But once you figure out where it is, you go up against the Technodrome itself, which is kind of a misnomer given that the Technodrome is supposed to be freaking massive, yet here it's like fun-sized or something. Now, in the NES game, this thing had various components which could be damaged and destroyed, but here in the DOS port, the only parts of the Technodrome which can take damage are the eye radar up top and the turrets. The lightning shot out from the front and rear use the same damage code as spikes and seaweed, and thus deals 8 hit points of damage. The turret shots deal 9 hit points of damage, and the Technodrome itself does indeed have 128 hit points as suggested by its health gauge. Figuring out the hit points of the turrets, though, was virtually impossible at first. They don't flash when they're hit, so you can't tell if and when you actually hit them. But something very curious I noticed is that when you quit the game and reload it, something awkward is happening with the memory management, and when you get back into the fight with the Technodrome, so long as no other enemies show up between quitting the game, reloading, and returning to this battle, the boss health gauge temporarily reports the hit points of the left turret before you had quit. Then after a moment, it very briefly shows the hit points of the right turret before you had quit. Then finally, everything resets and it shows the Technodrome's appropriate amount of health for the current battle. If not for this little glitch, it would have been far more difficult to figure out the hit points of the turrets. But with some testing and a lot of reloading, I determined that they each have 36 hit points. Then finally, Area 6, inside the Technodrome. Now, most of the enemies here are unique to this area, and there aren't really a lot of new designs to speak of, but they are all exceptionally deadly. Now first there's some wall-mounted turrets, which can't hurt you on contact and have 36 hit points, while the shots they fire deal 9 hit points of damage. Next we have Hellijunks, which are kinda like the Henks, but have less hit points at 10, and deal more damage at 17. Now next we have the Rocket Men, which float around and shoot lasers at you. The Rocket Men themselves each have 35 hit points, deal 21 hit points of damage on contact, and their lasers dish out 26 hit points of damage. Then finally we have the Tailnoids, which are kind of like robotic kangaroos, each having 57 hit points to burn through and dealing 24 hit points of damage on contact. Oh yeah, there's also technically spikes in the Technodrome, but someone forgot to actually give them hitboxes because they do literally 0 damage. And of course, no fight through the Technodrome would be complete without a final battle with Shredder. Yeah, anyone else find it weird Krang isn't in this game? Yeah, whatever. Shredder himself has 128 hit points, so yes, the health bars shown at the bottom have the same scale throughout the entire experience. Now, Shredder does a massive 58 hit points of damage on contact, meaning touching him just 3 times from full health is deadly. But then he's also got his life transformation gun, and getting hit by that thing is an insta-kill. And there we have it. All of the hit point values figured out for every enemy's attacks, the turtles' weapons, and the 4 various sub-weapons. It's nice to have a pro video that actually works out completely for a change, as oftentimes it's not possible to distill this information down exactly. But this time around, I am 100% positive on these numbers. And just a reminder, these are not the same numbers as the NES game, not by a long shot, especially given some of the mechanics there which did not make the transfer over to this one. In any case, you can find a link in the video description if you'd like to download this compiled data and save file hacking information for your own reference, for whatever reasons you can think of. But again, this is an objectively bad game and an incomplete broken port, so there's not really a lot of reasons to go back and play it. But just because a game sucks isn't going to stop me from figuring out its secrets. Anywho, that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on August 8th will be a standard review, episode 360. And we're going to be taking a look at a 3D dungeon crawl I've actually had for quite a while now, and just haven't really gotten around to showcasing. And for a second hint, this is one where you only play as one character. Yeah, there's no party diving here. You're entirely at your own wits for survival. Thus, make sure to stay tuned to check it out. Thanks for watching, and extra special thanks to every one of my supporters over on Patreon. Whether it's $1 or $10, every little bit helps, so please consider joining the ensemble over at patreon.com/KASICK.